Maybe to get started, I would love to hear about your general impressions of the article. Is China selling autocracy overseas? Why are more and more countries rejecting this US model of so-called democracy? And what do you make of this article in general?
Well, the article, it's a classic. It's a classic exercise. It only really works if you accept the assumptions that are behind it. It assumes that, of course, everyone's going to agree that China is an autocracy. It assumes that everyone is going to agree that China has some nefarious plan to dominate the world and is trying to export its system and impose it on other people around the world. But if you don't accept those assumptions, if you actually even if you read the article carefully, read the article critically, it points out a lot of things that go against what it purports to be saying. It includes statements about how popular the Chinese state is with its own people, about how effective it has been in improving the lives of hundreds of millions of people. It talks about how it doesn't overtly try to do anything about imposing itself on other countries, but it suggests that this sort of soft sell, as they call it, is they're trying to sneak the message in somehow. It even undermines its own critique of China, the idea that China is some sort of autocratic, top-down, dictatorial, monolithic society, by talking about how China presents itself. The idea of its own form of democratic process, and without any indication that that's other than what actually happens in China. If you just step behind the assumptions, the article basically falls apart, and ironically enough, includes a lot of information, a lot of statements, a lot of recognition of how completely dysfunctional American so-called democracy is, and how even has a passage somewhere in there about how, depending on what happens in November, or as here we are in the run-up to November, things are so chaotic and so potentially disruptive here in the United States. That sort of makes it a little difficult for the United States to aggressively promote the idea that our system is really the one that people around the world should be embracing. There's also a mention of America's history of intervention in the internal affairs of other states, about the fact that we're a warfare society. It's an article that I think is really only going to be credible to people who already think exactly the same way and believe exactly the same things.
But Ken, Foreign Affairs is the foreign policy journal of America's ruling elite. It is the foreign policy journal of the Council on Foreign Relations. It's how the elites, the ruling class, talks to itself. And clearly, they are of the opinion that China is, quote unquote, an autocracy. How do you see it? Is China an autocracy?
No, I mean, China is far from being an autocracy. China, for one thing, the level of political participation by people in China is much higher than that in the United States. In the United States, there's a relatively small handful of people who are actively involved in political affairs, who are active members of political parties, or who actually go out and do the work of campaigning every few years. But most of the time, most Americans are pretty much disengaged from political activity, from any meaningful input into the political process. Whereas in China, just the Communist Party itself, of course, has a membership of about 100 million people now. That's 1 out of every 7 adults. That's a very high level of political participation. And there are many other forms in which people are politically engaged. You don't have to be in the Communist Party to be politically engaged. But there are other forms in which people participate, non-government organizations, popular movements of different kinds. It's a very dynamic, a very lively political culture. It's one in which, of course, we're always fed the idea that there's all this censorship and all this thought control. And again, that's based, as even this article itself kind of reluctantly admits, it's based on the fact that so few people in the West, especially in the United States, actually know anything about China or have any direct access to information about China. One of the scare things that the article talks about is how China is, putting out information about itself, and how people around the world, as they encounter this information, find it to be very interesting and very convincing. And so, this isn't a culture that's trying to hide itself. This isn't a political system that's trying to secretly manipulate and control people. It's one in which people have ideas, people have opinions, and there are diverse opinions. There are diverse opinions within the party. There are diverse opinions within society at large. And those are expressed in various ways. Sometimes those take the forms of popular protests, popular demonstrations. That's the Chinese people exercising their constitutional rights, their rights to participate in their system. The West loves to portray every little demonstration as something that, it's on the brink of overthrowing the communist system. But in fact, these are the things that make the communist system, that make the system in China powerful, viable, strong in its own way. So, the idea that it's an autocracy it's just leftover Cold War propaganda, which has no real relation to the way that the society functions today.
And to me, this article sounds like sour grapes on the part of the U.S. because, it is undeniable that more and more countries are turning to China, turning away from this U.S. model of neoliberalism, of IMF loans, toward the Belt and Road Initiative. And there's no sort of reflection around, could there be a reason why? And if you ask those countries, it's because, China, unlike the U.S., actually respects country sovereignty. If they do something that they don't like, they're not going to try and overthrow their government. And they offer deals that are mutually beneficial to both parties. It's a very win-win business relationship. Why is it that China is so successful, and why are these countries turning toward China and away from the U.S. model?
Well, I think we need to look at this kind of from two related perspectives. One is that there's this fundamental reconfiguration taking place in global relationships. This has been going on since late in the 20th century, and it has only accelerated as we've moved into the present century. For 150 years or so, maybe a little more than that, the core industrial states of the West maintain this monopoly on modern productive technologies. And as long as they did that, they could control and manipulate the rest of the world, either through colonialism or, after the end of direct colonialism, through forms of neocolonialism, financial colonialism, things like that. And the United States came to be at the heart of that system. And so the United States built its wealth, the wealth of its elites, the wealth of its billionaires, on the backs of the labor of people all around the world, in a system where we controlled the productive process and they produced the raw materials and bought the finished products. That's come to an end. The monopoly on modern productive capabilities has been broken. And it's not just China that's done that. This is something that's happened around the world. Here we see a thing on the BRICS summit on screen. BRICS, all the countries that are in BRICS, these are countries that have begun to develop their own domestic economies in the interest of their own people, not as subordinate components of a global system focused on the imperial West. So that's one dimension of what's going on. And I think that countries in Africa and Asia and Latin America, the people in those countries are interested in having economies and having political leadership that works for their own interests, that works to improve their livelihoods, to enhance the material conditions of their existence. But the other side of that is that, the United States, as the principal imperialist, sort of neo-imperialist power in the world over the last 70 or 80 years, has been engaged in Africa, has been engaged in Latin America, has been engaged in parts of Asia, in ways that have generally either involved warfare and death and destruction and all this, or have been exactly the kind of debt trap that Lincoln tries to pretend is something China's perpetrating. You know, the IMF, the World Bank, you know, the major financial institutions in New York and in London, you know, these have lent money and have imposed political terms, imposing austerity, imposing harsh constraints on social programming in countries around the world, and as a result of that, the lives of people have either, you know, barely scraped along or have actually deteriorated the quality of life for people in countries all around the developing world. China comes along, and yes, of course, they're making loans, although they also give out a lot of grants. But China's not a philanthropy. China, you know, the Belt and Road Initiative, other things that it's involved in. When they talk about win-win, what they mean is things that are mutually beneficial. Right? And that means that, of course, there's benefits for China. You know, they want access to markets. They want access to resources. They want to, you know, they want returns on the investments that they make. You know, they're not running this as a charity or a philanthropic endeavor. But it's mutual. It's win-win. Both sides win. And the way that works is clearly been demonstrated. You know, that the lives of people in countries where China has invested in infrastructure, in institutional development, things like that, things are getting better in many of those countries. And that's why people, you know, it's just very practical thinking. That's why people are willing to look at, you know, the Chinese model. And they see that what has worked in China appears, at least initially, to be working for them. And it comes not without, connections and relations with China. Of course, you know, China's not going to drop something off in a package and then go home. China's there for the long haul. China's there for mutual development over a protracted period, building the Belt and Road infrastructure around the world. This is something that's going to play out not over the next year, the next 10 years, maybe the next 50, 100 years and beyond. These are long-term development investments, and that's a perspective that China is able to take. But, you know, this idea of sort of exporting the Chinese model, China doesn't have to export its model. China just has to do well itself. People look at China. People look at the way the lives of the Chinese people have been transformed. And what are they going to say? We'd like that same thing to happen for us, right? Whereas they look at the United States, not only has the United States systematically exploited and oppressed countries around the world, but, you know, the lives of our own people are going to hell in a handbasket. You know, you look at the Chinese model, it doesn't include things like people living in cardboard boxes out on the streets because they lost their jobs. You know, it doesn't include people, having to make a choice between paying their rent and buying food for their kids. It doesn't include people who can't afford to go to the hospital and get health care because they don't have insurance and they don't have enough money to pay the exorbitant bills. You know, the practical difference between what happens here and what happens there, that's all that's needed for people to get a sense that maybe they should check out China's model, China's experience. You know, not that China's going to say, we're going to loan you money, but you've got to reconfigure your country exactly like ours. That's not what they say. But if people look at the Chinese experience, people look at the way the Chinese people's lives have been changed, and they think, maybe that would work for us, well, then China's willing to help them give that a try. That's really all that's going on.
But in your opinion, Ken, what is it that China is doing right that makes it work so well? I mean, one of the things the Chinese say is that, you know, what we have is a whole process democracy. What we believe in is that in performance legitimacy, we want a system that delivers the goods, that performs rather than is purely performative, as is often the case here. So in your opinion, what is it that China is doing right? What is it doing that makes it effective?
Well, I think it's very simple and straightforward, and it's something that the Chinese leadership talk about pretty consistently, which is putting people as the priority, you know, not profits. And we can see that in so many ways, in terms of practical actions that take place. It's not just the statistics that we see, the growth of the economy, the rise in life expectancy, the decline in infant mortality, the expansion of education, the availability of housing, the tremendous growth in the space that people have to live in and the quality of the life that they live within their homes, healthcare, education. It's just amazing across the board, all those kinds of things. But we can also see it in some very big, sort of big picture things. There's two that KJ, I know you've heard me talk about before, but two major experiences that I think demonstrate what it is that China does right and what it is that China does different, right? One was how the 2008 global financial crisis was dealt with. China took a big hit, as the Western economies imploded, as the speculative bubbles that had been pumped up without any sense of responsibility or integrity, as those burst and people lost their homes and lost their jobs and, it just went into these terrible times. China had to lay off, the factories in China laid off something like 20 million people because consumer demand for goods to be exported from China just collapsed. Right? Those 20 million people, though, their experience was radically different from that of people who lost their jobs in the West, because China's socialist system includes what's called the household registration system, right? Under which everybody has a household registration. They have a place where, they're registered, literally, where they're documented. That's where they're from. That's where they're registered. Now, a lot of people in China don't live where their household registration is these days because so many people migrate, they move around, they seek better, employment, things like that. But when those 20 million or so people lost their jobs, they didn't wind up on the street. They didn't get 6 weeks of unemployment benefits and then, wish them good luck. They had homes to go to. They could go back to the villages from which they had come. They would be provided with housing, with basic health care, with educational opportunities for their children. They weren't simply abandoned to their own resources. Good luck out there. Let the market solve the problem. And that's because China has accumulated social resources, social assets through its economic growth, and it's able to deploy those in ways that provide a meaningful underpinning for these kinds of circumstances, these kinds of situations. And so that doesn't mean everybody was living in the lap of luxury. The provision of these services in the countryside especially is, relatively basic, but they weren't just dumped on the street. There weren't tent cities of homeless people in Shenzhen or in Shanghai, because people were going to be taken care of by the system. The leadership adjusted some of its policies. They tried to emphasize production for domestic consumption over production for export. There's still a lot of export from China, but they've recalibrated that. And within a year or so, those 20 million people were either back at work where they'd been or they'd found new employment. But they got through that transition without just being abandoned by those people in power, which is what, of course, happened here to so many millions of people, that wound up, sleeping in parks or their cars or whatever. The other thing, of course, much more recently is how China coped with the pandemic, how China coped with COVID. They put people before profits. They made the health of the people their priority. And so while we lost, 1.1 million people in the United States in a population a quarter the size of China's, China lost fewer than 6,000. Even when the restrictions on the COVID restrictions were lifted a couple of years ago, there was a bump, there was a rise in mortality, but it still didn't, it didn't go over maybe 60,000 or so. So a tiny fraction of what we suffered here. Because again, those same social assets, social resources, wealth that had been accumulated from production, from trade, from those exports, that was available to the state to be deployed to build those, hospitals, to develop those vaccines, to feed the doctors and the other medical personnel who were, putting their lives on the line to take care of the Chinese people. They put the people as the priority, saving the lives of the people. Whereas in the United States, the COVID pandemic was a profit opportunity. You look at the annual reports of the pharmaceutical companies, the insurance corporations, the hospital corporations. They made record profits during the pandemic. That's basically a crime, and it's a stark contrast. It highlights the difference. What China does right, what China gets right, putting people first.
But China is not a democracy. And it just kind of begs the question, what good are these like lofty democratic values like freedom of speech, human rights, if we don't have economic rights first, if you can't feed your family, if you don't have a house to live in, if you can't afford rent, if you can't afford food?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very much the tone of the article. That it's almost like China's playing some kind of shell game. They've lifted 850 million people out of poverty. They've built all these schools and hospitals. They've developed housing so that people live in really comfortable circumstances who used to live in very harsh circumstances. They employ people in huge numbers of productive capabilities. The tremendous transformation. People who, China was just celebrating the 75th anniversary of the establishment of the People's Republic. That's my lifetime. I was born 3 weeks before the establishment of the People's Republic. In my lifetime, the lives of the Chinese people have been unbelievably transformed. And the idea somehow is that was a trick. That was something that we shouldn't look at that, because the reality is that they don't have the right ideology. They don't have the same constitution that we do. They don't express and shape their political culture exactly the way that we do. It's almost as if the Chinese think that they're a different people, a different society, a different culture, when what we know as Americans is that everybody in the world wants to be and should be just like us, right? I mean, it's an arrogance that's almost unbelievable, except that as KJ was saying, this is the organ of the American foreign policy elite. If this is what these people actually think, and it certainly would appear that for many of them it is, that is not a good sign. That is not a good sign, because it suggests that their ability to understand the realities of what's happening in the world around us, this move away from a unipolar American hegemony to a multicentric, world of change and development and sharing, if they can't even understand the basic dynamics of that, we got our work cut out for us, because we have to do everything we can to help American people understand that China's not their enemy. The things that are happening in China don't threaten their lives. What threatens their lives are the policies and the practices of our elites, who are desperate to hold on to their privileges and are willing to really risk everything for the sake of their bank balances, I guess.
Points. And I just want to reiterate the point that you made earlier, which is that China is not the enemy. It's the U.S. ruling class that's the enemy, which is why they see, these kinds of really important institutions like the Confucius Institute and these kinds of people-to-people exchanges where people can really understand, what China is really like. You can see why the U.S. ruling class would find them so threatening and why they're trying to shut these kinds of exchanges down. But
Yeah,
Ken,
absolutely.
yeah, thank you so much for joining us this week on the China Report.
It was great to be here. Good conversation.